Hi all, our notable game today is another recently played game from the London Chess Classic. This is in round 3. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave 2765 is playing Veselin Topalov 2803. So let's see what happened in this game. E4, and now we have from Topalov the Sicilian defense. We go into the Najdorf variation. And believe it or not, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave chooses a move which we've seen some Fischer games recently. This H3 move, it's in live book, it's quite way down the list. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, but 8th most popular move. There's been about 2,000 games in live book with it. It's an interesting idea, an interesting set of ideas behind it. For example, G4 later, fianchetting the bishop, maybe G5 later. Now black reacts with an energetic forcing move E5. It does weaken the D5 square a bit. It's a bit double-edged. Knight DE2, and if white follows up with G4, that would seem quite logical for bishop G2 later. Now black's most popular move is actually to stop G4. Black's most popular move is H5. You might think this is a bit odd, doesn't it? Weaken G5. Well, it's popular though. Is it that exploitable, the G5 square here? That's the thing about the complexity of chess. You think there's these weaknesses, but it also, you have to factor in how actually they can be exploited to actually be weaknesses. So here we see, instead of bishop G5, which is the most common by a little bit, G3 is the next most popular. So still wanting to fianchetto the bishop to exert influence over the D5 square. It's very, very logical stuff. Quite often black plays bishop E6 here. In this game we see knight BD7, bishop G2, B5, so black's trying to fight for the center with bishop B7 and later B4, but there is a downside. These pawns are slightly vulnerable, potentially, in their own right. They're underminable. The rook hasn't moved. It's ready and waiting for A4 at some point. We have here now knight D5. So the knight getting out of the way in advance of B4, not minding to swap a piece outpost, well, for the queen or the pawn. Let's see, after knight takes D5, actually queen takes D5, which keeps the frontal pressure on D6, gains a tempo on the rook. Generally white, unless he has a specific idea in mind, doesn't usually want to play E takes D5. Sometimes it does create some sort of pawn majority on the queen side. Really depends on the position. We have rook B8. And now bishop E3. So it gives white some extra options instead of the routine castling. If knight C5, there's not extra options to take on C5, which would actually be quite dangerous for black, because the queen takes E5 after. So bishop E3, non-stereotypical, keeping an eye on the dark squares. We have here bishop E7, and the queen drops back. We have now knight F6, and both sides now castle. And now the move king H2. So tucking the king safely away. Maybe in the future white might be interested in F4, and this diagonal will be potentially backfiring sometimes on white. So king H2 tucks the king neatly away for the moment. Black plays now bishop B7. And we have a defensive maneuver, knight C3, protecting E4. And in the event of B4, there's knight D5 here, still shielding that E4 pawn from the glare of the two pieces. We have rook C8. And white encourages B4 from black by A4, trying to undermine this structure or cause some extra weakening or weak squares. In fact, after B4, we have now knight D5. So white, on this occasion, is prepared to put a pawn on D5, and in some respects it would seem to solve a major issue for black. Black does take on D5, is a major issue solved? Yes, that one is, but there's a new issue emerging here. These pawns are slightly vulnerable. Black plays a5, and that's not the end of the story there. The b5 square has now been slightly weakened, just ever so subtly. And this next move is designed to look at that. Black, if left by himself, might play next move bishop a6, which might be quite useful. But queen e2 stops bishop a6 and also introduces the possibility of queen b5 hitting b7 and putting pressure on a5. Topalov here needs to tread carefully, in fact. Even though it seems quite simplified and as if there's no real problems for black, it seems like a comfortable position if we look at this for black in many respects. His king safety is good. What's the issue? If queen b5 is treated as a serious threat, an idea might be queen e8. It's an engine suggestion, just to keep control of b5. And here's a sample variation. Say c3, like this. If white wants to put some pressure on the queen side, this might be one way of doing it. So this kind of pawn sack. But even here, you know, it's held in balance a bit. So this is a line where white's going crazy with a pawn sacrifice. But in the game, yes, in fact, Topalov is more adventurous. He invites the possibility of queen b5. He plays bishop g5, trying to weaken white on the dark squares. And of course, by swapping this bishop off, then rook c5 becomes available as a resource, which hits d5 and prepares the double rooks. It's all very logical to get rid of the dark square bishops here, if black wants to play on the dark squares. Is it at some cost? White takes here. Okay, so the squares are weakened, particularly c5 could be useful for black. We have h4 though with tempo. Perhaps here the queen should have gone back to e7 to keep the bishop protected. This seems like an invitation too far, this next move. Queen f6 was played. It's not protecting the bishop. It's curious. It's quite a curious move. If we just quickly look at queen e7, queen b5, we can see with the bishop protected, the queen can be safely evicted, protecting the pawn. Very neat. And black gets to double rooks, so that would be no good for white to do that at all. It would justify black swapping off the dark square bishops to, you know, weaken c5. That helps protect and attack things. But this queen f6, it invites queen b5 here, hitting the bishop. And the queen now drops back. Is this some sort of strange trap that Topalov is setting? The c2 pawn is loose here though. The danger is when taking a pawn, you're giving your opponent a pass pawn potentially, and here there's a potential passed a pawn to factor in, as well as the undermining of this little pawn chain here that b4 is going to drop soon after, one would think. In fact, white doesn't bother defending c2 here in this position, and if he does, then it's going to run into something like rook c5. Rook c5 will evict the queen, as previously mentioned. So queen takes a5, while white's got a chance to do that. And now hitting b4, rook takes c2, and here there's a resource black has to be extremely careful as well. Rather, white has to be extremely careful as well. If white routinely takes the pawn here, then this rook's on the 7th rank. Bishop a6 is going to be useful to hit this rook and take on f2. Even this queen c7 first though is possible here with bishop a6 in reserve. And this would be quite nice for black. Should be at least equal. White has to maybe do something like this to hit the rook, and we get a position where black should be okay with f4 coming. Even though white's got two passed pawns over here, black should be in the balance here. Counterweight is provided here for the passed pawns. But so yeah, a tricky position. Rook takes c2 is played, and white's not wanting to play queen takes b4. It does relinquish control of the diagonal potentially. White plays rook ac1. And there's another tricky moment here. Black takes on b2 and it looks for a moment, hold on a sec, isn't rook c7 really tempting? Is this the idea? This backfires, I believe, to queen d8, and we're going to check this. This is a pin here against the queen. Let's check this 100%. If rook c7, it seems potentially tempting. Yes, queen d8 is in fact pretty good here for black. This is awkward, just very awkward. If queen b6, bishop a6 now becomes possible. The queen's overloaded. And if the rook moves, black's getting a good game. Bishop d3. With queen f6 coming next. Or e4. This is starting to be good for black. Black's going to have counter pressure on the second rank. So yes, white shouldn't allow that stuff. He doesn't play rook c7. He's not tempted. He plays rook b1. And the rook tries to avoid being exchanged off to keep the pressure. And in fact now white does relinquish control of the a6 square. With queen takes b4, bishop a6. So if the rook moves, rook takes f2, but the rook doesn't move. Instead white counters with queen b3, attacking this rook. And we transition now, bishop takes f1, queen takes a2, into an outside past a pawn situation. And you might not think this is too significant. Surely this isn't significant here. This a pawn. Black took on g2, slightly weakening white's king. And rook a8. Is this really dangerous, this a pawn? It is pushed to a5. Now here, I want to give you an engine evaluation. Engines are not usually good. Even now, sometimes with passed pawns, you have to let them run a bit. It does give white a clear advantage, actually, this position. It is tricky, and it's giving moves, blockading moves like queen a7 and queen c7. In the game, we see e4. e4 is not that bad in itself, although it doesn't seem to enhance black's position greatly, because e3 is a threat which can be parried elegantly with rook b3. So there's no stuff of e4 and queen e4 check happening now. That can be snapped off. Now this next move puts back black, Topalov, in a very precarious position indeed. It's another committal move. You might say, well, if you play A, you want to follow up with B and C, etc. But in this case, by playing B, supporting the pawn, which might seem as though f4 is quite dangerous, because then to hit h4 or f3, although this seems dangerous and seems logical as a follow-up, it is weakening not only this diagonal but the second rank. You see that g7 pawn is more exposed on the second rank without the fellow pawn there. It's more kind of isolated in a way. It's not technically an isolated pawn, but it's feeling the breeze more. Let's put it like that. It's feeling the breeze. White's next move, queen d2, is actually that there's possibilities here now that queen d2 are it's introducing by supporting the pawn like this. Things like rook b6 maybe coming up. I'm going to turn the bits off here just to give you more intuitive reasoning about this position. What is going on here? Pardon me about this arrow. Queen d2. There's a possibility here. There's an underlying tactical possibility in this position that with queen d2, in fact, you might not think this, but a6 might actually be threatened in this position. I want to demonstrate that now. Black in the game played queen c7 here, which might not be optimal. But if black plays, I don't think is optimal. If black, for example, plays rook a7, white has the tactical resource a6. You might think, how is this possible? a6. Couldn't it just be taken? Thing is, check. And here we have Queen E2 double attacking A6 and H5. We've got two loose pieces basically, if you include pawn as a piece, and they're being double attacked here, and this is just nasty. This is just losing for black, this scenario. So it shows actually black's got weaknesses on both sides of the board. This is just terrible for black. Here, Queen G5 mates, for example. So there's a distinct danger that A6 is going to be useful coming up, and Topalov's move seems to want to stop the idea of Rook B8 check. Now, possibly addressing this weakness here, in this position, Queen F7 might help hold the balance a little bit longer. So say A6, we can just snap that off here safely. There's going to be no double attack. So say Rook B5, Queen F6 in this position. Queen F6, and here black after A6 can avoid the tactics and actually play F4, and is providing counter pressure here now against white. So say A7 F3 check, black can actually end up being better here, can actually safely take there. So this should be quite dangerous, this position for white potentially. So it seems as though, yeah, Queen F7 is a good move, and white would have to tread carefully in this position. It's not only defending H5, it's putting pressure on D5, and there's still life in the position a bit. Even though white's got that dangerous outside past A pawn, there's still some life in the position. But I mean, if to prove that a little bit more, let's explore this a little bit more. It's given as an advantage for white. Say Rook B1 F4, white could take, and now black might have a position. It's tricky. It's tricky. White's still in the driving seat in this ending, and rook and pawn endings have a lot of finesses. But apparently, white's got an advantage. Might be less than a pawn here in this example. So you get the picture that actually in this position, it seems as though Queen F7 might be the most accurate move. It addresses tactical vulnerabilities. It also introduces some tactical ideas like Queen F6 and F4 at the right time. But in the game, we have a bad collapse from this position at move 33 instead. A very bad collapse. Queen C7, it suffers from horrendous tactical idea, a really horrendous tactical idea, which fully exploits one of the weaknesses pointed out of F5. Can you see what white plays in this position? If I give you 5 seconds starting from now, white play here. You might want to pause this video. Okay, Queen B2. It looks at G7 and Rook B7's on the cards. This is really dangerous for Rook to enter the 7th rank. You can see that, if it takes Rook B7, how is black actually defending G7? As well as Rook B7 being threatened. This is a desperate position. It's terrible, really. And you might think, hold on a sec. Okay, isn't there some tactics for black? Black did take here, and Rook B7, and tries to distract tactically the queen, protecting the rook by a counter-attack, counter-deflection. Rook A2. So of course if takes, then takes. But here, now there's an A and B, but in terms of logical sequences, but B's step here, step B for white here, is an exploitive move, not creating weaknesses, unlike the E4 and F5 concept. This Rook B7 can be followed up elegantly and aggressively, without concession, with a very powerful move in this position. Can you see white's play in this position, what he can do? If I give you 5 seconds here. Okay, Queen B5. Yeah, looking at E8 now, and again bouncing off there to take on H5 is really dangerous. this h5 is a continual issue from earlier in the opening prophylaxis against white's g4. And here, technically best is queen c1 to hold on a bit longer in the game, but it's not that great. But that wasn't played. I'll show you it first. Queen c1, check, losing h5. This queen coming back. This is leading by force basically into what can be considered a lost ending. As an example, this sort of ending example is essentially lost for black. It's lost. But that is technically the best move to play queen c1 here, it seems. Instead, rook takes f2, and it would be good if there was a perpetual check, but is there a perpetual check? Queen c2, check, queen e2. It doesn't look very likely, actually, that there's a perpetual check. Yeah, maybe one of the ideas was e3, but in fact Topalov just resigned here. Let's have a quick check what he might have thought. e3. If white plays this, then it's mate in 1. So white wants to avoid the mate in 1, but king takes e3. Check. Check. Now here, if king g5, then there is check here and queen d4. So unless white wants perpetual, he has to really take on f5. Then we have check, 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 and the king's just safely, well, before losing the rook, queen f3. The king's going to be out of the checks soon, one would think. One gets a position where the checks run out. It's a rook up, basically, isn't it? It's a rook up. One would think white can eventually get out of the checks, so it wasn't actually tested. Topalov just resigned. Yes. Unfortunately, yes. Topalov's second loss. He's a former world chess champion. Very creative, aggressive grandmaster, not afraid to take risks. Obviously, in this game, there's a big risk that stands out playing this f5. Might not be immediately obvious as a terrible move, but later it kind of shows weaknesses on g7 and this diagonal, playing a move like f5. So maybe it's easy in retrospect to say, oh yeah, the risks, what the risks were, because they were demonstrated as being risks, obviously. But yeah, an aggressive fighting game from both sides. So MVL Maxime Vachier-Lagrave choosing an old system that had been employed by Fischer. Also, Anand and Karana have been using this h3 against the Najdorf. So it's sidestepping a lot of theory, and it's a very logical looking positional move. In this game, white sealed up the d5 square, but was able to get some queenside pressure, resourcefully not allowing black a good occasion for bishop a6. When it was allowed, white was able to simplify and get a post outside a pawn, which actually proved quite a dangerous distraction, if not queening. It was, in some variations, a dangerous distraction to create a loose piece tactic in some of the underlying variations. So Topalov cracked up trying to defend b8, and his earlier f5 really was punished with this queen b2 for g7 being an issue. And in the end, yeah, he basically had a lost position, and he could have prolonged it a bit with more accurate queen c1, but he ended up sacking a rook, which didn't have any promise of a perpetual check. It's easy as spectators to criticize games with engines, etc. nowadays. Very easy. It's harder to play the game under the real time pressure, etc. And also note, maybe he really did want to try and bounce back in this tournament. He's the only person to have lost games actually so far. All the other games in the first 3 rounds have been draws, except for his 2 losses. But, you know, credit to him, you know, he provides excitement wherever he plays. So that's great for spectators and us on YouTube. Okay, comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.